I think let's get going and talk about truthiness in storytelling. Brief obligatory slide first, though, about Tonic and who we are. I know some of you know us and some of you know us less well. Essentially, what Tonic does is we help to build brands that people want to work for. And there's a whole bunch of ways we do that listed out on the slide there. You know, we do insight, we do EVP and brands, we do people communication, we do social and digital. But the point is, we like working with exciting employers and with people with ideas at those employers, and helping them to do something remarkable and special. But that always begins with insight. I would say that because that's my role at Tonic. So like an awful lot of people who work in insight, this isn't where I intended to work. This is something I kind of fell into. But I've now been doing it for about 15 years. And I'd say that the key aspect behind all good insight is a degree of heresy and a degree of looking at what everybody else believes to be the case and just asking a few more questions about it and looking at it from a slightly different angle. And that's what I want to do today is talk about truthiness from that respect. So, truthiness is a word that was coined by the guy you can see on your screen, Stephen Colbert, who's an American satirist. This was a long time ago. He was talking about one of George Bush's election campaigns and the various adverts that were going out to the American public during that campaign. And he said, the weird thing is we no longer care whether something's true or not. What we care about is whether it's truthy, if it has truthiness, and whether it feels like it ought to be true. And actually, that maybe that's more important than whether it is true or not. And Stephen Colbert was joking, but like all the best jokes, actually at the heart of it, there's a really important truth there that I'd like to get into. And it's about this idea of whether something is authentic, but there's a really huge difference between whether something's authentic and whether something's true. And that's what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion about as we go through the deck. So let's start by rewinding several years. I went to an absolutely fascinating seminar hosted at Cambridge University about the neuroscience of psychology. And it was a really interesting event where they got together some academics from very, very different disciplines. So neuroscientists who look at the brain like a machine, and psychiatrists who treat the brain, and psychologists who try and understand the brain. And they had a stage full of them all talking about what was going on in that world, what's interesting about it, and how those disciplines are starting to intersect. But the opening of the event, one of the senior academics got up and gave this slide to make sure that we, the audience, could understand what was going on, because there were some students there, there were some just interested members of the public there, like me. And this was his summary of everything you need to know about neuroscience and psychology. And he said, it's like this. Your brain is the decision-making engine that builds a model of the world and tries to predict what's going to happen in it. And that is what it does from the day that you're born to the day that you die. And it gets better at it and it gets worse at it. But all the way through your life, that is what it is trying to do all the time. And it's trying to do that so that you can make better decisions. And it's trying to do that, you know, if you go back further in human history, so that you could survive and you didn't get eaten by something. But point number two is it has absolutely no access to that real world that it is trying to model and predict. And it's only got sensory inputs. You know, your brain is inside your skull. It's not able to contact the world directly. It has to get everything through these messy, ambiguous, noisy, and incomplete inputs that are things like your vision, which isn't perfect. In fact, it enters your brain upside down and your brain has to turn that picture the right way up again. Or your hearing, which isn't brilliant. You know, the classic thing of, was that a gunshot or was it a car backfiring? Actually, we don't know very often what these sensory input means. So what your brain does is it's got a store of past experience that it uses to work out what's probably going on from this messy signal. And the longer you're alive, the more that builds up. But it lets you go, no, that probably is a car backfiring. It probably isn't a gunshot, because, you know, based on my past experience, that's what it was last time. But that you know, leads us to this really important point that perception isn't a passive process, but a really active, creative one. So, you know, the most passive person on this presentation right now, who is perhaps just sat in a chair, looking at a screen and listening to my voice through this, they may think they're being quite passive, but actually their brain is incredibly active right now. And what it's doing is trying to predict what am I going to say next? Why am I saying that? What's about to come? And you couldn't turn this off even if you tried. And it's a really interesting idea because it means that the whole of perception is really a controlled hallucination where you are inventing this model of the world based on the information you have about it. And there's an incredibly fine balance. And if anything goes wrong at any of those stages, that can be all sorts of illnesses, not just mental illnesses, but physical illnesses. Epilepsy is something going wrong with one of those stages, as are an awful lot of mental illnesses is something going wrong with one of those stages. So this was a really fascinating idea that I'd never heard expressed so succinctly and so persuasively. And I think it's relevant to the world of what we do in employer branding, which is that our candidates are trying to build a model of us all the time. So if I say to the people on this call, have you ever considered working for IBM? Even if you try not to, your brain immediately starts trying to build a model of what working for IBM might be like. And it might be that you've got some really good insight into that because you know someone who used to work there. Some of you know me, I used to work there. Others of you have absolutely no connection to that company other than knowing the logo perhaps and one or two things you've heard on the grapevine. And you start building this model. And if you don't have information, your brain will make information up and put information in there and start to build that model. So when we building an employer brand, a big part of it is we're trying to improve people's model of us as an employer. We're trying to make sure that it's fair and that it's accurate and that it does represent the very best of what we offer. Because if we don't, their brain will start creating models to fill the gaps that we don't tell them about. So that's point number one. So let's start thinking a little bit about what we can learn from storytelling. So the quote on the screen is from a really interesting guy who's a Daily Telegraph journalist in the UK called Will Storr. He writes various other publications as well. But he was interested in the science of storytelling, and he wrote a book with that title. And really it came about because he was having writer's block in his endeavours to move into the writing fiction. And he kind of wanted to understand, why do stories work and how do stories work? And he spent a long time traveling the world talking to people who either understood how the brain worked or understood how stories work, and asking them, how do I tell a story that people believe in and feel in? And one of the key revelations he came to during this journey was this one, is that all stories are about change. And the brain is obsessed with movement, not absolute position. And this is kind of really interesting idea. And I'd say to you right now, wherever you're sat, there's probably some background noise in the background that you have been consciously or unconsciously shutting out. So in my case, there's a main road just over there that I'm starting to ignore because it's been there all day. And actually, this is really, really important when it comes to telling an employer brand story that people will listen to, is if we tell a story that's very static and very flat, people's brains just aren't conditioned to deal with that. Our brains are conditioned to notice things that are moving or changing or getting better or getting worse or getting bigger or getting smaller. And actually this plays into some of what we're going to get onto later on in this about how we tell a story that people will pay attention to. But we're in a good place when it comes to telling stories, which is that people are innately curious. So I put on screen quite a long quote that I'm not going to read out in full. But this is Sir Colin Blakemore, eminent British neurobiologist, talking to another academic about the nature of humanity. And one of the things that he was interested in is this idea that human beings have this kind of intense curiosity that continues throughout their life. And he even argues we should have been called Homo curiosus rather than Homo sapiens, because it's really our curiosity that makes us humans rather than what we already happen to know at any given point. But this is really good news for us when it comes to telling stories, is that as long as we're not being very boring, people are interested. People do want to hear stories. People do want to learn, and people are interested. However, as a counterpoint, I will offer you this quote from Douglas Adams, who I always tend to quote, who says, human beings who are almost unique in having the ability to learn from the experience of others are almost remarkable for their apparent disinclination to do so. And there's a point there as well that actually people are easily bored. And if we tell boring stories, people aren't going to listen. But there's a fine tradition of teaching each other stuff and explaining things to each other through stories. And this has gone on since the dawn of humanity. So you can look in any culture anywhere in the world, or any religious tradition anywhere in the world, And you will find that the way that people agreed ideas and principles and ethics and laws and morals was they told each other stories, whether that's Jesus telling parables or whether that's what we have on screen is Aesop's fables, or indeed, the modern youngsters who are learning right and wrong from watching episodes of Sesame Street or Peppa Pig. It's the same thing. It's telling stories to share ideas and higher truths. And we're incredibly well conditioned to learn this way. We love the personal story, the case study that teaches us a lesson, that explains how I might do something better or differently. So brings us to starting insight number 2 is, if we can tell people a good story, people will listen to us. And we're going to look at what the components of a good story are as we go on. But I'm afraid we're going to start with a bad example. So an example from our world, which I think is quite instructive, is Amazon. And I do feel deeply sorry for Amazon for this story. And I hate using them for an example, because I don't think they did an awful lot wrong, but they did do something ever so slightly wrong. What they did is they set up a bunch of ambassadors, as many businesses have done, and said to them, can you start tweeting and talking on social media about your time with us and what it's like to work for us? And there you see a couple of examples on screen. There's Hannah, an Amazon FC ambassador. FC is fulfillment center, which is their word for the distribution centers and warehouses that they operate. And over on the right there, we have Carol saying, when you see your favorite leadership principle, just couldn't resist the photo op, #customer obsession. And there she is pointing at customer obsession. Now, there's a problem here, is that Amazon is an organization that lots and lots of people look at, and lots of people look at who don't like them very much and are prepared to start picking holes. And although you and I may know someone like Carol who has a favorite leadership principle, a lot of people out there in the world don't know someone like Carol who has a favorite leadership principle. And so they start getting very suspicious. And what happened next to Amazon is that the internet started going, I don't believe you. And this is a story from TechCrunch that happened really quite quickly after they launched this. And they found all the Amazon ambassadors and put them side by side and started writing about them and saying, who are these people and why are they saying this stuff? And being very suspicious of it and assuming that actually someone is up to no good here and not telling the truth. And actually it kicked on and got bigger and bigger. And some of you may have seen some of the coverage of this. So, BuzzFeed runs an article saying Amazon says those weird brand ambassador accounts defending the company are run by real employees. Over on the right, you have a sample reaction from someone on Twitter. All their tweets sound like someone being forced to read something out at gunpoint. Now, the point here is that, when Amazon were challenged on these brand ambassadors, Amazon said, oh no, but they are employees and they're telling the truth. And what I think they got wrong is they thought truth was more important than truthiness. And they defended it by saying, yes, these are people who work for us. They've worked here for long enough that they can say something. They're allowed to say what they think. But actually, they'd missed the point, is that the things that those people were saying weren't believable, even if they were true. They lacked truthiness. And as long as they lacked truthiness, they weren't going to do them any good, because it didn't matter that it was true. People were reading it and going, I don't think that's true. I don't believe that's true. And they weren't ever going to go and fact check it. They just made that assumption that they were lying. And that's hugely problematic, because if you tell something that lacks truthiness, people immediately start assuming that you aren't telling the truth. And then they won't believe other things that you say that might have been more believable. But they've now established in their heads that you are a dubious source. So this is a real challenge for us when it comes to employer brand storytelling, is our stories have to look true, actually, whether or not they are true. I know some extremely successful recruitment and advertising campaigns that have been essentially parables built off, actually not a real story, but an example of what is meant. And people are quite happy with a parable. But as soon as you tell someone this is a real employee, it has to be believable, as well as simply what you would like to be the case. Otherwise, they're going to start doubting you. And that doubt spreads very, very quickly. So the challenge we have in the modern world is that it's increasingly difficult to tell truth from fiction. So side by side on screen here, what you've got is over on the left of your screen, you've got The Onion, the satirical website, trying to be funny, saying company commits to hiring more Bengal tigers in effort to improve office biodiversity. And over on the right, you've got an allegedly genuinely true story from the Daily Mail about a company in Bucharest hiring a cat as their communications director. Um, and this is the real challenge for job seekers, is that it's quite difficult for them to tell truth from fiction these days. And they're having to do it all the time. They're having to do it with the news. They're having to do it with things that they get from people they buy things from. They're having to do it with people they might want to work for. They're having to do it with communications that come from their existing employers. And we are constantly making these decisions about whether we think something's true or not. Which brings me to Rob Recht, and I want to talk to you a little bit about Rob Recht von Amarongu. And despite what it says on the screen, he's not the CEO of Shell. He's a very naughty individual. Rob Recht is an IT guy in Holland who decided to see what happens if you change your job title on LinkedIn to the CEO of Shell. There's absolutely nothing to prevent you from doing this. LinkedIn relies on us all telling the truth, and he decided it'd be interesting to see what happened if you didn't. So he changed his job title to the CEO of Shell. And immediately, the following things happened. You can see over on the left-hand side of the screen, he got 400 likes, 800 customized comments, 500 emails with a personal message. 10 of his closest co-workers called him within 2 hours. And, enormous amount of people got on with him. But he started categorizing and breaking down how people had reacted to what he'd done. And over on the right, he put the 6 categories. And he said, the weirdest bunch in many ways are group 1, the people who just accepted that he'd gone from the job he was in to being CEO of Shell, and even tried to justify it and said, well, no, this makes absolute sense that, Shell would need to become more IT focused. And so they started trying to justify this incredible piece of information they'd been given. Because they assumed it had to be true. There's then a second bunch who tried to correct him, and the corrected bunch, and they sort of said, oh no, I think it must be a different company, maybe Shell something else, or it can't be Shell, the oil company. And they started trying to correct him on what he declared. A third bunch kind of checked it, were checking, saying, are you sure? Did that really happen? And not sure. There was a fourth bunch who got very angry with him and said, no, you can't do this. LinkedIn is a serious place for serious people. You mustn't do this. There was a fifth category of people being opportunistic and trying to get business out of it. As he said, got a lot of people trying to arrange new business meetings. And really only a very few people fell into that sixth category of people who understood that it was a joke and that he wasn't being serious. And of course, he wasn't the CEO of Shell. But they were by far the smallest grouping of pieces of contact that he got. I thought it was a really fascinating thing, because when you think about the whole hierarchy of LinkedIn and the way it works, assumes that we're all telling the truth, that we do all work for the company that we say we're working for, that we all do have the job title that we say we do, and we all accept there might be a degree of artistic license taken with particular achievements in a role, but we do assume a certain degree of truthiness going on in people's LinkedIn profiles. But actually, there's no mechanism to enforce that at all. Which is, a really startling idea compared to the others, the more social networks like Facebook, where we assume that there might be a lot more lies going on. We don't necessarily assume that someone's profile is who they say they are. But actually, LinkedIn relies on us all believing each other. And there's an interesting thing going on here that was summarized by this guy. He's an Italian IT guy called Brandolini, who came up with Brandolini's asymmetry principle. And what he said was that the amount of effort it takes to make up bullshit is 1/10 what it takes to prove that it is, in fact, bullshit. And actually, Rob Recht's example is a great one to sort of think this through. It took Rob Recht seconds to say that he was CEO of Shell. Now, it would take me less than a minute to find out that he in fact wasn't. But nevertheless, it's going to take me a lot more time to find out that he's lying than it takes him to lie. And this is the real challenge, is that, I've seen people assert before that, job seekers will fact check things that you say. And I always severely doubt that. I go, well, no, they could fact check stuff that you tell them. But the reality is it's going to take them 10 times the amount of time it took you to say that thing. And an awful lot of them aren't going to bother. And people don't fact check stuff very often. Actually, what they do is they make a split-second decision about whether they believe it to be true or not. And once they believe it to be true, they believe it to be true. And once they believe it to be not true, they believe it to be not true, regardless or not whether it actually was true in the first place. So I'm just going to tell you one more story along this theme, because I think it's quite instructive, and it's from earlier in my career. So some years ago, I was helping a large employer recruit lots of IT people, and it all had to be done very, very quickly. So we had a kind of sprint session where we got everyone in the room who was going to be involved. So we had talent acquisition, we had HR, we had the hiring manager, we had me, and we had another supplier in the room. And we were all discussing what we were going to get done very, very quickly. And there was a really interesting moment in the meeting when someone from HR said, one thing that's going to slow us down is when we get the CVs in, we have to send them off to this external body to check that people are telling the truth on them. Because IT people are the worst for telling lies on their CVs, and they claim they've got experience they have, or they claim they've got certification they don't have. They turned to look at the department head and kind of quite jokingly said to them, "Why do you guys all lie on your CVs?" And brilliantly, he looked her straight back in the eye and said, "I'll stop lying on my CV when you stop lying on your job descriptions." And I thought it was a really interesting observation, because actually there is this distrust between employers and potential employees, in that we don't always believe what they're telling us, and they don't always believe what you're telling them. And this is a really challenging idea when it comes to telling our employer brand story, is that people are actively and passively filtering for fake news. And sometimes you're going to tell them something that they're not even going to think about before rejecting out of hand, because it just feels too untruthy for them. Sometimes they're going to think about it for a little bit and reject it. It's comparatively rare that they're going to spend a long time making this decision. So I want to tell you a couple of stories, and at the end of this, there's going to be a little bit of audience participation. So I'll ask you to come off mute at the end if you've got an idea. So I'm going to tell you two stories, and I want you to tell me what these two stories have in common. So story number one is about the early days of the space race, and when the Americans were planning their missions. They spent millions and millions of dollars developing a pen that could write in zero gravity and that would be able to write upside down in space. The Russians instead use a pencil. Story number two is that when President Kennedy was touring the space station in the 60s, he saw a man with a broom sweeping up, and he went over to him and said, "What do you do here?" And the man looked him in the eye and said, "I'm helping to put men on the moon." So those are my two stories. Anyone in the group care to come off mute and tell me what those two stories have in common? It's all gone quiet.
I guess space is something that connects the stories.
Yeah. Any other guesses? I'll tell you the answer. The two things those stories have in common is that they're both completely made up, and they're not even slightly true. And actually, there's very good reasons why they're not true. The one about Russians using the pencil, the Russians didn't use a pencil. That would have been a really silly thing to do, because graphite leads conduct electricity. And if your pencil lead cracked in a space shuttle, it could go off and complete an electrical circuit. It would have been an absolute disaster. It's not even slightly true. That's what happened. And the other story is more obviously kind of not true, is that President Kennedy was a really clever guy. Now, if he was walking around a space station, if he was walking around NASA headquarters and he saw a guy with a broom, the last thing he's going to do is go over him and say, "What do you do here?" He might have gone over and said, "How long have you worked here?" or "What's your name?" But he's not going to ask someone with a broom what he does there. And there's no record that this ever happened. But actually, there's a huge amount of people believe both of these two stories are true. And the reason that people like to believe these two stories are true is because we like the message they carry. On the one hand, it's a message about not over-engineering stuff and a simple idea being a brilliant one. And on the right-hand side, it's a brilliant story about participation and teamwork and collaboration, and we love the story. So we like to believe that they're true. But I'm afraid that I'm 99% certain that both of them are completely untrue, and the best I've been able to research. And I'm afraid it gets even worse than that. The story I told you a few minutes ago about me in the meeting with the IT department and the "I'll tell the truth on my CV when you stop lying on your job descriptions," that didn't happen either. I made that up. What I did was I sat down and I went, what is a truth that might appeal to people in this group? Okay, let's make up a story about it that therefore carries that truth. And I told you a story. And actually, I don't know, I'll leave it up to you to decide whether you were taken in or not. But when I've done this before in the past, most people tend to believe that story because it sounds true and we like the message it carries and it feels like it ought to be true, but I'm afraid it isn't. But it's amazing how quickly we make these decisions.
Marcus, this is Ilana. So actually, I have to be honest, I really believe that story about CV. So, great job on
Thank you. Very kind of you to admit it. but it's a really interesting thing, though, isn't it? But actually, there's a really important thing behind this. And Mark Twain summed it up really well when he said, look, truth is stranger than fiction, but it's because fiction is obliged to stick to possibilities and truth isn't. And this is, when you're writing a story or making up a falsehood, you concentrate really hard on making it believable. So I thought carefully about that story and I thought, right, I need to tell you who was in the room. So I'll say HR were there and the line manager and talent acquisition. I'll throw in some details that make it believable. Whereas actually, if I'd been telling you a true story, I wouldn't have thought as hard about how to make it believable. I wouldn't have put as many details in. And oddly, even though if I told you a true story, it might have been less believable. You know, Mark Twain made this point, you know, and he was talking about, you know, there are things that happen in real life that you can't put in your novel, because although they definitely happen in real life, we don't believe these things. And if someone makes them up in a piece of fiction, we go, oh, that's nonsense. I mean, there are loads of examples throughout history. The one I quite often like to use is that, you know, in the period before World War II, there was a small area of Vienna where within a few streets of each other, you had, you know, Hitler lived there, Stalin lived there, Freud lived there. There were an incredible number of people who were going to be absolutely fundamental to world history, living literally around the corner from each other, and must have bumped into each other. Now, it's an utterly ludicrous thing. If you wrote this into a drama, people would go, no, that's ridiculous. They couldn't have all lived in the same place. But they did. They absolutely did. And it's a real challenge when it comes to telling true stories, is we often don't think as hard about whether something's believable because it happens to be true. And actually, that's when you need to think harder about it. Because it's true, we need to make sure it sounds true. So, fifth startling insight is that we believe things that we instinctively agree with, and we doubt things that challenge us. And when we get on to employer brand storytelling, this is where you need to have a think about the messages that you want to give people and think about how believable they are instinctively. And you probably find you've got a mixture in your employer brand framework. So, for example, if I'm working with a technology company and they want to tell their audience that they're innovative, I go, okay, that's going to be pretty easy. You're a tech company. People are probably okay with believing the fact that you are innovative. So, for example, you know, in recent times, I've been working with a pharmaceutical company that has lots of patents. And I kind of go, okay, if we tell people you've got lots of patents, they'll believe that because you're a pharmaceutical company. It makes sense that you'd have lots of patents. All right, that's believable. Whereas some things you might want to tell people might challenge their innate beliefs and their instinctive views of you. So if, for example, let's say you're something like a law firm and you want to say that you've got great work-life balance, now that's going to be a real challenge because people believe that law firms are places where you're going to have to work really, really hard and it's going to be long hours. So if you're going to conflict with their instinctive beliefs, you're going to need to work harder to convince them that it's true. Even though it is true, they're going to start out by doubting you. And the problem is once they doubt one of the things that you tell them, they start doubting everything you tell them. So it's really, really important to think very, very hard about, of the things that I want to tell my candidates, what are the ones that are basically going to go down fine straight away? And what are the ones which are less likely to be instinctively believable and I'm going to have to work a bit harder with? So I'm going to play you a little video. We did a sound check earlier, so the sound on this should be fine. But I think this is really, really important, this bit. So this is a short video of Kurt Vonnegut. Anybody who's not familiar with Kurt Vonnegut, he is one of the great writers of the 20th century. He's an American, and he won an awful lot of awards. But what I'm going to play you is a short excerpt that he gave about the shape of stories. And actually in the preamble, he tells people, which I'm not going to play you, in the preamble, he tells people that this was a rejected master's thesis he wanted to do at the University of Chicago, and they told him he couldn't do it because it was too simple. But actually its simplicity is its brilliance. So I'll let him speak for himself.
Well, there's no reason why the simple shapes of stories can't be fed into computers. They are beautiful shapes. This is the GI axis, good fortune, ill fortune. Sickness and poverty down here, wealth and boisterous good health up there. Here's the very middle. Now, this is the BE axis. B stands for beginning. E stands for electricity. Now, this is an exercise in relativity, really. Is the shape of the curves are what matters and not their origins. So we'll start a little above average. Is why get a depressing person? We'll start... The whole thing, we call this story Man in Hole, but it needn't be about a man, and it needn't be about somebody getting into a hole. But it's just a good way to remember it. Somebody gets into trouble, gets out of it again. People love that story. They never get sick of it. All right, not copyrighted. Another story, also a beautiful curve and easily fed into a computer, called Boy Gets Girl, but it needn't be that. Just a way to remember it. start on an average day, average person, not expecting anything to happen a day like any other. Finds something wonderful, just loves it. Oh, God damn it. Got it back again. People like that. Now, these are beautiful curves, and this gets a little complicated. Computers can now play chess, so I don't know why they can't digest this very difficult curve I'm going to draw for you now. And it so happens that this is the most popular story in our civilization, Western civilization. As we love to hear this story, every time it's retold, somebody makes another $1 million. You're welcome to do it. Now, surprisingly enough, I've said it's depressing. You know, people don't like stories about below average days and people. But we're going to start way down here. Worse than that, who is so low? It's a little girl. What's happened? Her mother has died. Her father has remarried a vile-tempered, ugly woman with two nasty daughters, big daughters. You've heard it. See? Anyway, there's a party at the palace that night. She can't go. She has to help everybody else get ready. She has to stay home. Now, does she sink lower? No. She's a staunch little girl, and she has had the maximum whack from fate, which is the loss of her mother. She can't go any lower than that. Okay, so the fairy godmother comes. Gives her shoes, gives her stocking, gives her mascara. Gives her means of transportation. Goes to the party. Dances with the prince, has a swell time. Boring, 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 boring. Now, there's a slight inclination to that line as I've drawn it because it takes perhaps 20 seconds, 30 seconds for a grandfather clock to strike 12. Does she wind up at the same level? Of course not. She will remember that dance for the rest of her life. Now, she poops along on this level till the prince comes to shoe fits. She achieves off-scale happiness.
So hopefully everyone could hear that okay. But I think there's a really interesting idea in this. And he goes on in the longer version of it to talk about all the different types of stories that people like. There's a few of them on screen there. But I think there's a really significant point here is that very often when we tell stories about our companies, we tell this relentlessly flat story where everything started out brilliant, it continued to be brilliant, and everything in the future looks very, very rosy. Now, that may be what we feel like we ought to say because we want to be positive. However, if you tell an incredibly flat story, it's incredibly boring. None of you have ever been to see that movie. No one has ever read that book. And particularly when we're talking about employee stories, there is an opportunity to talk about the shape to that story and actually the highs and the lows and the difficult times and the good times. Because those are the things that that people are kind of interested in and that help people to believe a story and kind of and engage with it and get emotionally involved with it. And you know, the current situation we find ourselves in right now is actually offering companies an opportunity to talk about this, right? Every company is faced with a current level of adversity, and it doesn't matter what sector you're in or what part of the world you're in. Actually, the seismic shock of, you know, the oil barrel going through the floor and many countries being in lockdown. Actually, there's a really interesting point for companies to talk about what they did during the tough times, because most companies are having a tough time at the moment. And actually, if we add some shape to our stories, they become much more interesting. Back to that point I made much earlier about us being conditioned to notice change. This is really one of the major problems I have with an awful lot of employment stories, is that they don't have shapes and they try to be a bit too relentlessly upbeat. And I understand why, but I just think it's not a very good way to make it into that decision-making engine. So, believable stories have shapes and require peril or loss. So, we're going to get really into storytelling now. So when I was trying to think about this issue, I decided that I needed some first-hand advice. So I got in touch with the guy on the right there, who you probably haven't heard of, but he's a guy called Jack Thorne, and he wrote all the things over on the left. So there's various TV series he wrote there, but he also wrote the Harry Potter play. He wrote the adaptation of His Dark Materials that was on the BBC back in the autumn, or the film Wonder with Julia Roberts. He also had the misfortune to have the room next door to me at university. And he's won endless BAFTAs and Oliviers and Tonys and any other kind of writing award you would care to name. So he's kind of quantitatively and qualitatively the best fiction writer I know. And I contacted him and said, right, Jack, tell me, how do you make a story believable and lovable? What is it that you do in the world of fiction that makes people believe you? And I'm going to share with you, absolutely unedited, his response. And he said, for storytelling, I'd say vulnerability. Finding a vulnerability that people can relate to without knowing they're relating to it. Something unexpected that leaves it a bit, oh yeah, that. And giving them time to get to know a character on their own terms. You'd be surprised how important it is to see a character sitting in a car listening to the radio, or sitting alone in their bedroom whilst their partner goes to the bathroom. It sounds like shit, but I think it's true. However, I know nothing, no one knows anything. So that was the advice from a many awarded writer on how to tell something true. And this kind of got me really thinking about what makes people in stories likable and believable, because this has relevance to which employees we profile and how we profile them. And I found this really interesting blog from someone looking at Spanish literature. And they drew this parallel between two writers writing at roughly the same time, about 400 years ago. So Torquato Tasso and Cervantes. And over on the left, you've got Torquato Tasso, who had two heroes called Tancredi and Rinaldo. And Tancredi and Rinaldo were perfect and chivalrous and brilliant and won everything, and were charming and superb and handsome and won all the ladies fair and all the rest of it. Over on the right, you have Cervantes, who was writing about Don Quixote, who is a deeply flawed character, who charges at enemies who aren't there, and who is supported by Sancho Panza, his long-serving but deeply flawed manservant, who tries to keep him out of trouble, and they get into scrapes, and it all doesn't go perfectly, and everything is far from ideal. But the really interesting thing about this is that 400 years later, far more people are talking about Don Quixote and Sancho Panza than you will ever hear talking about Tancredi and Rinaldo. And the reason is because we all know someone a little bit like Don Quixote or a little bit like Sancho Panza, whereas none of us have ever met anybody like Tancredi and Rinaldo, unfortunately. They don't exist. And actually, they're not very likable because they're perfect. Perfection isn't lovable and believable. And this is really important when we start telling employee stories, is if we tell a story of our stellar employee who's never got anything wrong and got promoted every 5 minutes and has this ridiculous trajectory, it's not very believable, it's not very likable, and it's not very identifiable with. I look at them and go, well, that can't be true. And even if it is, that's not what happens to normal people. And there's a real challenge of being too relentlessly positive. I'm just going to play you the opening few seconds of this, because I think this is a company doing it really well. This is an employer brand video from HSBC that some of you may have seen. But they chose to do something really interesting with the opening of their employer brand video.
So this is current time, 3:48, and it's not afternoon, it's in the morning. One part of my job that I don't like is the early morning call.
I'm sitting in the office alone. It's a big day today.
I'm not going to play you the whole video because it's quite long, but what's really interesting about that video is that they start with some negatives. Now, later on in the video, they have an awful lot of people talking about the things that are wonderful about working for that organization and how motivated they feel every day. And it kind of moves through a day, and as people arrive at work, the messaging becomes a lot more positive. But what's really interesting about it is because they started with something that is believable because it's not positive, and actually it's not that negative, but it's someone showing you the downside of their job, and that many of us can recognize. If you've worked in a global organization, the call at a silly time in the morning or at a silly time in the evening is something we've all experienced. And actually, because they've shown me a flaw early on, I'm way more ready to believe them when they start telling me really positive things later on. I think it's a really fantastic example, and something that I looked at and thought, gosh, I wish I'd done that. That's really well done. And it's something that I think we should all take a leaf out of their book. The next very short point I want to make, though, is also about something that increasingly does get used in our sector, which is personas. And I'm sure many of you have used these. I've helped create these for clients. And we'll create a persona of the kind of person we might want to recruit, and we'll talk about, the demographics and the behavioral identifiers and things that they like doing and media that they consume. And we use it to do all sorts of useful things like media planning and creating our websites and all sorts of things like that. But I always try and encourage my clients to remember these aren't real people. And they're very definitely not real people. And the reason I know that they're not real people is that they don't have any flaws. And at no point does it say, Justin can't really be bothered after 2 o'clock on a Friday, or Mark secretly hates big meetings because he's quite introverted. And we create these kind of, these really weird personas that are still very useful, but we have to recognize that they're not real people. And all the real people we want to connect with actually have flaws and aren't perfect and do have weak points in their CV and aren't going to be 110% what we're looking for. But actually, if they're 95%, that's fine. And I always worry a little bit that people start talking to people who aren't real, even if they've managed to talk as people who are real. So that's a very brief one. So yeah, your audience are flawed too. Don't tell stories to stereotypes. And it's back to that point. Give them someone relatable. Give them someone who in your organization who they can feel a bit like. And one way you can start to have the bravery to put some honesty into your brand is to talk about trade-offs. And this is something I use a lot when I'm trying to hire people to work with me over the last sort of few years. Is very often, if you want to sell someone an upside of your organization, a really effective way of doing it is telling them the downside of that upside. So to give you a really practical example, when I want to talk to someone about the fact that when they join Tonic, they're going to be able to have an impact, I like to say to them things like, now the thing about Tonic is that we don't like doing things the same way twice. So actually that does mean you're going to have to think about things from new every time. And there's no easy day in the office where we just roll out the solution we had last time. I'm afraid that's not good enough. But on the upside, you get to think and you can have an influence. And actually, if you have a brilliant idea on day 2, you have a brilliant idea on day 2. But because I've started with the negative of the positive, actually it suddenly makes that positive so much more believable. And on the screen, I put a few things that I think are at the very least in tension with each other that you can use to make that kind of play. So for example, if I wanted to tell someone career acceleration, I might go, now, the thing is you are going to have to work very long hours here and we are going to push you very, very hard, but on the upside, we'll promote you quicker. And that suddenly makes the will promote you quicker really, really believable. Or alternatively, you might say, now I'm afraid that this isn't the place to come to if you want to get promoted really quickly, but we do really value work-life balance and you're going to have a much better time of it here. Conversely, you can do it the other way. You can use one to sell the others. Likewise, if you want to tell someone that you are a place where they can have that personal impact, you could do it by saying, now I'm afraid that this isn't the place where we're all going to get into a committee room and chat about things a lot. You're just going to have to get on and do it by yourself. Or alternatively, the flip side round is, if you want to sell someone on your collegiate environment, you say, now I'm afraid if you want to be a hero, this isn't the kind of place where you can do that because we like to talk about things and come to a consensus before we do something. But by introducing the negative of the positive, you've somehow suddenly made the positive much more believable. And again, you can do it with, flat hierarchy versus a place where you can get promoted. You can do it with, we're informal and friendly versus we're professional and elite. You can do it with we're agile and innovative versus we're stable and well run and we've got a very good structure. Because those things are slightly in tension with each other. And if you're brave enough to admit some of the drawbacks, actually you can make a really strong sell about the upsides of it. So penultimate insight is people believe trade-offs much more than blanket promises. So I think that's it's a good technique you can use to make your promises more believable. So the very last thing I want to talk to you about is actually, last but not least, is crafting your stories. And one thing, even if people have got the rest of it right, one thing that goes wrong when people tell stories is that they tell them in quite a boring way. On the screen, I've got with you a few examples of people trying to take brevity to extremes. So the first one there is by South American author, Latin American author, I suppose, called Augusto Monterroso, who was challenged, who created the shortest ever novel at the time, was what he was trying to do. When he woke up, the dinosaur was still there. And he said, look, this contains all the elements you need for a novel. It's got a hero, it's got an anti-hero, it's got a plot, it's got a moment of tension. The middle one is quite a famous one that often gets attributed to Hemingway, but in fact it predates him. No one's quite sure who came up with it, but it's often said as the saddest short story ever written: baby carriage for sale, never used. Or you'll see some versions of it: baby shoes for sale, never used. The last one I particularly love. Recently there was a challenge thrown out to a lot of today's leading authors about could they come up with a 6-word novel. And the one at the bottom is Margaret Atwood's attempt to write a 6-word romantic novel. Longed for him, got him, shit. And it contains everything you need for a romantic story. Spin that out into a 3 episode serial on the TV. But actually, there is something really, really important when it comes to employment stories, is that quite often we tell them in a boring way. And it all starts with the opening line. When you look at brilliant writers, what they do is they hit you with an opening line that makes you want to read more. So the top one here, the important thing was not to get himself arrested immediately. So that's by Italo Calvino in one of his short stories. And you land straight in the middle of a story, and immediately you're gripped, and you want to know, well, what was he going to get himself arrested for, and who's going to arrest him? And this is all very exciting. And straight away, I'm into the middle of the action. The second one, anyone recognize the second one? So it's Christmas Carol, Dickens. But it starts, and Marley was dead to begin with. And you kind of go, well, hang on a minute, this is quite exciting. Who was Marley? Why is he dead? And what do you mean to begin with? How can someone be dead to begin with? What's happening next? And it's a brilliant way of starting off a spooky story, because it's an incredibly spooky opening line. Or the third one is, some of you may recognise, in 1984, George Orwell. It was a bright, cold day in April and the clocks were striking 13. And immediately he set the tone for something that's going to be really interesting and exciting. And the last one was one a colleague recommended to me. It's actually Crow Road in a Manx starts with, "It was the day my grandmother exploded," which is a fantastic opening line to a book. You want to know what's going on there and what's going to happen next. When we tell employment stories, very often we start with an incredibly boring opening line. I lost count of the amount of employee profile videos that I've seen that start with someone going, "Hi, I'm Stephen and I'm a systems analyst at company X." And you kind of go, I'm sure you are, but that was an incredibly boring opening line. Why did no one help you come up with a better opening line for a story? Because if you bore someone in the first few seconds, they close that video and they're not going to watch the rest of it. So actually, there is a much more interesting way of starting those stories. So, if we take our fiction example, one way of doing it might be, if we've got someone to tell us about, the toughest day they've had at work, and then you started their story, and instead of saying, "Hi, I'm Stephen, I'm a systems analyst," they said, "Let me tell you about the day I got something horribly wrong." And then they told you about their toughest day, and then they told you about how they fixed it, and they told you about the supportive environment that helped them do it, and the training they've been on since that meant that they haven't made that mistake again. But isn't that a much more interesting opening to the story, to start with something that immediately tempts me in and makes me want to know, well, what's that all about? And are you about to tell me something that feels slightly dangerous? But so often there isn't enough work goes into telling these stories in an interesting way. Now, the absolute master of this, and I always recommend to people, the person who is superb at grabbing people's attention is Victor Hugo. And some of you may know this already, but when Victor Hugo published his stories, they weren't published as novels, they were published as part works. So essentially you had to buy the newspaper every day and you'd get the next chapter of his story. And on the screen, I've got one of my favorite of his chapter titles. So this is from Notre Dame de Paris. And one of the chapters is entitled, I'm not going to attempt the French because my accent's terrible, like all English people, I can't speak French properly. But it translates approximately to, "On the danger of confiding your secrets to a goat." Now, that's a story I want to read. Now, Victor Hugo had to be brilliant about this, because if he didn't give his chapters interesting titles, I might not buy the newspaper that day. So he was driven by an absolute commercial need to intrigue me and interest me into clicking into the next chapter, as it were, but back in the day. And this was how all the newspapers were sold in France. But he had this brilliant way of looking at his titles, and you'll find that you don't get boring chapter titles in Victor Hugo books, but it's because he had to keep on selling you why you wanted to read this. And we could learn a lot from him when we start selling people our next employee video or the next piece of our employee website. Why don't we give it a more interesting title that makes me want to read more? So that's the last kind of insight I'd share with you. Insight number 10 is, craft your stories and don't just tell them. Because too often we tend to just kind of go, well, we've got a story and it's true, so that'll do. And really, if there's anything I'd like you to take away from what I've been saying, it's that true isn't good enough, and even when it is true, we need to say it in an interesting way, because otherwise it's never going to make it into this decision-making engine. And one thing you need to bear in mind is the piece of communication you're creating. Where are you going to use it? And those of you who attended the seminar a week or two ago that my colleague Ruth ran about content, will have seen her talk a bit about this. So I'm not going to spend much time on it at all, but it's a conversation that you're having with candidates, and you have to remember where they are in your journey. If you're making a piece of content that you're going to put out somewhere, say on social media, at that point they don't know you yet, they don't trust you yet, they're not ready to believe an awful lot from you. once they're on your careers website or on your LinkedIn pages, I'm now someone who's interested in you, who's maybe interested in a career with you. They're at a different stage. They're further on. They're now ready to believe more from you or listen for longer. So actually the whole what you can say, how much you say and how you say it will change through the candidate journey. And as they come towards you, they're more and more inclined to believe you because they've started to buy into your process. So just to circle back to where I began on this, the whole point about this is we're trying to invade this decision-making engine. We're trying to invade it for good reasons because we want to give people honest information about why they'd have a brilliant time working for us. But I think a huge thing that gets missed is that people concentrate a lot on the logic of what they want to say, and they concentrate a lot about, the individual headlines that they're going to use to say it, but they don't think enough about how believable is what I want to say and how am I going to do something about that and how am I going to make sure I make it into this decision-making engine. Because if you never make it into this decision-making engine, you might as well not have bothered at all. And it's actively filtering stuff in and out, actively and passively filtering stuff out. So I've done an awful lot of talking at you, and I don't know whether people have had questions or thoughts along the way. I know Tom's been looking at the chat. If you have managed to send anything over there, Tom, have we got anything already asked that we could deal with first, or we could maybe move to questions?
Yeah, I think we can go straight to questions. But I mean, if while I'm talking, there's one I have for you, which is if you think about you talked about story shapes earlier on, using Kurt Vonnegut as your muse. If you think about the average shape of an employer branding story, what does that normally look like? Because to me, that seems like a straight line, right? But what do you think?
So I think there's a whole bunch of places you can add shape to a story. So there's your corporate story where you can add shape, where you talk to people about, this is when our company went through a massive growth phase. This is where we had struggles because we hit after you go through a growth phase, there's always a difficult teenage years, if you like, that come after a growth phase. This was what's sticky, or here's a bit of our business plan that we tried and it didn't work. And actually it was all okay. And now we're doing this and this is looking much more positive. So there's the corporate level shape to stories. But then there's also individual employee journey stories, which definitely have shapes. So if you think about someone joining your organization, they will have a path of experience that will involve periods when they are growing and learning and getting promoted, and periods when they're not, and they're actually perhaps operating at a level for a while. And then they might go through another growth phase. And then they might, so being able to talk to people about the fact that, the journey of someone's career with you is not a relentless upwards progression. It might involve some sideways steps, or at occasions might involve someone taking a step backward to move into a different department. And that's okay. But actually telling people stories that have shapes to them rather than merely presenting people with, I think people's default assumption is that I join you and then I'm supposed to get promoted and then I'm supposed to get promoted and I'm supposed to go up this ladder relentlessly. And actually, we all know that tends not to happen in companies that have a pyramid structure and get narrower towards the top. So it's not even a very believable story, the kind of relentless one. And thinking about how you can add some shape to it. I mean, it's even more easy to add shape if you've got entry schemes like a grad program where you can think about, okay, what trajectory does the grad scheme has? It probably has a learning bit and then a doing bit and then a learning a bit more bit and then an ascending into management bit. How do we tell people the shape of that progression rather than just trying to hit them with one relentless message? Does that make sense?
Yeah, very good answer. Thank you.
Does anybody else have anything that they like to ask or like to throw into the discussion?
I've got a question, Marcus. It's Bill here.
Hi.
Do you think that the level of truthiness, obviously this is a kind of an overarching theory, but do you think that that varies depending on what channel or format you're speaking to the audience in?
Yeah, completely. And it also depends who you are as an employer as well, right? So, you have to take a long, hard look at how trustable are we as an employer. And some of you may work for organizations that your candidates haven't heard of, in which case they don't know you from Adam. Sometimes, you're working for an organization they vaguely heard of, but don't know a great deal about. Sometimes you've got a positive reputation with them. Sometimes you've got a negative perception with them that you're going to have to tackle. And then the same thing plays out on the different channels. We believe and disbelieve things on channels to different extents. Back as I was talking about with LinkedIn, we have this weird assumption that people are generally telling the truth, even if they're exaggerating a bit on LinkedIn. However, that doesn't seem to apply on Facebook, and people are very suspicious of things they see on Facebook and Twitter because people know that there are people on Facebook and Twitter who are actively, misleading you. Whereas we tend not to make that assumption on LinkedIn. you know, there is still a belief in the more formal a channel looks, the more belief people tend to have in it. But there's, you know, on the other hand, you know, I think there's a beauty that a lot of employers are exploiting at the moment with creating videos that look very unvarnished, where they'll have an extremely senior person just talking into their iPhone, apparently off the cuff. And I think in most cases it probably is off the cuff. And actually they're tremendously believable because you know that no one has been able to script that person. They are talking from the heart and telling you their story, or talking about what they think the future for the company is. Now that's quite dangerous and quite scary for a lot of companies. They feel very worried about letting people do that. But I think that that's a way to bring some truthiness into those channels, is by doing it through something that doesn't look quite as varnished, even if actually it's very, very consistent on the messaging front with all the things that you are saying in the more formal and varnished bits of communication, and they'll start to reinforce each other.
Cool, thanks, Marcus.
Anybody else got anything they'd like to ask about, or have I stunned you all into silence? Okay, well, in that case, I'd just like to thank everyone so much for joining us. You know, this is a topic that I hope you've heard. I've found really interesting to get thinking about, just for my own benefit, but hopefully it's been interesting and thought-provoking for you as well. I think we're going to share the deck with you all afterwards in case there's anything you want to refer to or take another look at or think about. But by all means, I'd love to have a chat. If anybody would like to catch up with me offline and just have a chat, whether it's over email or over a Skype call or something, I'm more than happy to chat with anyone about whether it's strategy, brand, measurement, or audience data, or testing creative work, because these are all the issues that I look at for Tonic and for our clients. And I'd love to have a chat with you either about what you're doing now and what you found about that, or indeed how we might be able to help you. But thank you so much for giving up an hour of your time. I hope it's been interesting.